The mess hall at Riverside Women's Correctional Facility erupted into absolute silence when Maya Chen dropped to her knees in the middle of the concrete floor, her weathered hands moving in patterns that nobody had seen before, creating something from nothing but determination and the dust that perpetually coated everything in this place. The fluorescent lights overhead caught the sweat on her brow as 300 inmates watched the quiet farm girl they'd all dismissed as weak suddenly command the attention of even Veronica Viper Steele, who'd run this prison's underground economy for 7 years without anyone daring to challenge her authority. What happened next would become legend in the California correctional system. But to understand how a 22-year-old girl from a failing wheat farm in Nebraska brought the most hardened criminals to their knees without throwing a single punch, you need to know about the morning she arrived 6 months earlier, clutching nothing but a worn photograph and the kind of silence that made everyone assume she'd be broken within a week. Maya had stepped off the prison transport bus that humid September morning with mud still caked under her fingernails from her family's farm. Her long black hair braided in the simple style her grandmother had taught her, wearing the standard-issue orange jumpsuit like it was made of thorns against her sun-weathered skin. The other new arrivals pushed past her, already forming alliances, already adapting to survive. But Maya just stood there in the intake yard, staring at the mountains visible beyond the fence like they might teach her how to endure what she'd been falsely convicted of. A corporate embezzlement scheme she couldn't have understood even if she tried, framed by her employer at the agricultural company where she'd worked data entry to save the family farm. If you've ever felt powerless against forces bigger than yourself, if you've ever been misjudged because of where you come from or how quiet you keep, then you understand why Maya's story needs to be heard. Hit that subscribe button for Acts of Depth, where we share tales of unexpected strength and the power that comes from staying true to yourself even when the world tries to reshape you into something else. Veronica had noticed Maya immediately, the way a hawk notices a field mouse, because in prison, silence is often mistaken for weakness, and weakness is blood in the water. The mess hall that first day became Maya's introduction to the hierarchy when Veronica's crew surrounded her table. 5 women with tattoos that told stories of violence and survival, each one having earned their place through fear or favor. "Farm girl," Veronica said, her voice carrying across the entire hall, making everyone stop eating to watch. "That's premium real estate you're sitting in. That's been my table for 7 years." Maya had looked up with those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths nobody expected, then quietly picked up her tray and moved to another table without a word, without protest, without the defiance that might have earned her respect but also would have earned her a beating. The mockery started small, the way erosion begins with a single drop of water. Veronica's crew would bump into Maya in the corridors, knock her books from her hands in the library, take her commissary items with smirking entitlement. They called her Mudfoot because of the farm soil that seemed permanently embedded in her soul. Silent Sue because she never talked back, never complained to the guards, never did anything but endure with a patience that infuriated Veronica more than any resistance could have. The other inmates started avoiding Maya, not wanting to catch Veronica's attention by association, leaving her isolated in a place where isolation could break a person faster than any physical punishment. But Maya had a secret that nobody could have guessed, something she carried from her grandmother's teachings on that struggling Nebraska farm, something that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with an ancient understanding of movement and energy that her Chinese grandmother had brought from the old country and passed down through generations of women who'd had to be strong in ways that didn't look like strength to outsiders. Every morning in the exercise yard, while others jogged or lifted weights, Maya would stand in the corner where the sunrise hit first, moving through what looked like strange stretches but were actually forms of Tai Chi her grandmother had modified, hidden within farm work movements so that even Maya's father never knew what his daughter was really learning all those years. The photograph Maya carried everywhere showed her grandmother, Lily Chun, standing in their wheat field at age 90, still strong enough to work 12-hour days, still graceful enough to move like water through wind. On the back, in careful handwriting, were words in Mandarin that Maya had memorized. "True power never announces itself." That photograph was in Maya's pocket the day everything changed. The day Veronica decided that 6 months of silent submission wasn't entertaining anymore, and that it was time to either break the farm girl completely or make her fight back in a way that would justify whatever came next. The confrontation was orchestrated for maximum humiliation, planned for the Tuesday afternoon when the mess hall would be fullest and the guards would be changing shifts, creating a 15-minute window where Veronica's rule was absolute law. Maya was carrying her tray of the barely edible lunch, watery beans and rice that tasted like resignation, when Veronica stood up from her claimed table and walked directly into Maya's path, causing the tray to crash to the floor in a splatter of food that painted Maya's shoes and the bottom of her jumpsuit. "Oops," Veronica said loudly, her crew laughing on cue. "Looks like farm girl made a mess. Better clean it up before someone slips." Maya knelt without hesitation, beginning to gather the scattered food with her bare hands, and that's when Veronica made her mistake. She reached down and snatched the photograph that had fallen from Maya's pocket, holding it up for everyone to see. "What's this? Your rice farmer grandma." Veronica's voice dripped with manufactured contempt. "Is this why you're so good at being on your knees? Family tradition." The laughter from Veronica's crew felt forced, uncomfortable, because even in prison there were lines, and mocking someone's dead grandmother crossed them. Maya's hand stopped moving. For 6 months, she'd absorbed every insult, every push, every small cruelty with the patience her grandmother had taught her, understanding that sometimes survival meant being like water, finding the path of least resistance. But the photograph in Veronica's hand was more than memory. It was the last thing her grandmother had given her before dying, just 2 days before Maya's arrest, as if somehow the old woman had known her granddaughter would need an anchor in the storm that was coming. Maya stood slowly, food still dripping from her hands, and for the first time since arriving at Riverside, she spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Give it back." The words were simple, but something in Maya's voice made the laughter die instantly. It wasn't threat or anger, it was certainty, the kind that comes from knowing something others don't. Veronica, who'd faced down women twice her size and never flinched, found herself taking an involuntary step backward before catching herself, her reputation requiring her to escalate rather than retreat. "Or what, Mudfoot? You'll cry? You'll tell the guards?" "You'll." Maya moved. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't violent, wasn't anything the witnesses could later describe as an attack. She simply shifted her weight and flowed forward like water finding its level, her hand extending in a motion that looked almost gentle until it made contact with Veronica's wrist at precisely the point where the nerve cluster would cause the fingers to open involuntarily. The photograph fluttered free, and Maya caught it without looking, her eyes never leaving Veronica's face. The entire exchange took less than 2 seconds, but everyone saw it. The unbreakable viper had just been disarmed by the silent farm girl without a single punch being thrown. Veronica's crew started to move forward, but Maya had already shifted into something none of them recognized. A stance that looked relaxed but hummed with potential energy, her hands open and low but positioned in a way that suggested readiness for whatever came next. "I don't want to fight," Maya said, her voice carrying that same certainty. "But I won't let you dishonor my grandmother. She survived the Cultural Revolution, the Great Famine, and 40 years of American prejudice. She taught me that real strength isn't about hurting others. It's about protecting what matters." The mess hall held its breath. Veronica's face cycled through emotions: surprise, anger, calculation, and something that might have been respect if she'd allowed herself to feel such things. The smart play would be to have her crew attack together, overwhelm Maya with numbers, reassert dominance through violence. But something about the way Maya stood, completely calm in the center of the storm, made Veronica hesitate. It was like watching someone stand in front of a tornado without fear because they knew something about wind that others didn't. "You think you're special because you know some kung fu?" Veronica tried to salvage her authority with sarcasm, but her voice lacked its usual edge. Maya shook her head slowly. "Not kung fu. Tai Chi. The art of redirecting force rather than meeting it. My grandmother learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers, going back 300 years to women who had to be strong without being allowed to be fighters." She paused, then added something that would later be remembered as the moment everything shifted. "I could teach you if you want to learn." The offer hung in the air like an impossible equation that nobody could solve. Teach Veronica? The woman who'd just tried to humiliate her? The guards would be back in 7 minutes, and everyone waited to see if this would end in blood or something none of them had witnessed before in their years behind bars. Genuine transformation. Veronica's lieutenant, a woman named Carlotta who'd been inside for 12 years, whispered urgently in her boss's ear, no doubt counseling violence to maintain the fear that kept their protection racket running. But Maya did something unexpected. She began to move. It started as a simple shift of weight, her arms rising slowly like she was moving through honey, her body turning with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who'd just been kneeling in spilled food. The movements were hypnotic, flowing from one position to another without pause, creating patterns in the air that seemed to leave traces of intention even after her hands had moved on. She was demonstrating, not threatening, showing rather than telling, and every eye in the mess hall followed her motion as she worked through a form her grandmother had called parting the clouds, which looked like someone conducting an orchestra only they could hear. This is what my grandmother did every morning until the day she died at 93, Maya said, never stopping her movement. In rain, in snow, in the middle of harvest when there was no time for anything else. She said it was like oil for a machine. It kept everything moving smoothly even when life tried to rust you solid. Her foot traced a perfect circle on the concrete floor, her hands pushing and pulling at invisible resistance. She worked the farm until 3 days before she passed, still strong, still balanced, still unbreakable because she understood that real power comes from inside, not from making others feel small. One of the newer inmates, a girl named Jasmine who couldn't have been more than 19, stepped forward from the crowd. "Can you really teach that?" Her voice cracked with something between hope and desperation. "I mean, could someone like me learn?" Maya smiled, the first time anyone had seen her genuinely smile since arrival, and nodded. "My grandmother taught me when I was 7. She said the only requirement was willingness to learn and patience to practice." Veronica's crew was fracturing. Some still stood ready for violence, but others were watching Maya with expressions that had shifted from mockery to curiosity. The power dynamic in the room was changing in real time, not through confrontation but through something far more dangerous to the established order: inspiration. Veronica herself stood frozen, caught between the persona she'd built over 7 years and something she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten it existed. The memory of her own grandmother, who tried to teach her ballet before the streets claimed her, before violence became her language and fear became her currency. "This is ridiculous," Carlotta spat, stepping forward with her fists clenched. "Viper, give the word and we'll—" But Veronica raised her hand, silencing her lieutenant with a gesture that surprised everyone, including herself. She was watching Maya's movements with an expression nobody had seen before, as if recognizing something in the flowing motions that spoke to a part of her that prison hadn't managed to kill. "Show me the wrist thing again," Veronica said quietly. "The thing you did to make me let go." Maya stopped her form and approached Veronica slowly, the way you'd approach a wounded animal that might attack out of fear. "It's not about strength," she explained, holding out her own wrist. "It's about understanding where the body wants to go naturally and helping it get there. Here, put your hand on my wrist like you're grabbing it." Veronica hesitated, then complied, and the entire mess hall leaned in to watch. "Now I don't fight your grip. I follow it, redirect it, like this." Maya's movement was so subtle it was almost invisible, but suddenly Veronica's grip was broken and her arm was extended in a position that left her completely vulnerable. Yet Maya wasn't holding her or forcing anything. "I'm not making you do anything," Maya explained. "I'm just showing your body a path it wants to take anyway. That's what my grandmother meant by true power. It's not about dominating others. It's about understanding the flow of energy and working with it instead of against it." She released Veronica's arm gently. "In the fields, she'd say the wheat doesn't fight the wind. It bends and survives while rigid things break." The guards returned to find something unprecedented. 300 inmates standing in complete silence, watching Maya teach Veronica the opening moves of a Tai Chi form in the middle of the mess hall, with even the most hardened criminals observing like students in a classroom they'd never known they needed. Sergeant Williams, who'd worked at Riverside for 15 years, later said it was the most surreal moment of his career. Not because violence had been avoided, but because something had fundamentally shifted in the air itself, like watching winter turn to spring in a single moment. Word spread through the prison like wildfire over the following days. The farm girl who'd been everyone's target had somehow turned the most feared woman in Riverside into her student. Not through force, but through something nobody had a name for. Maya began teaching in the exercise yard each morning, starting with just Veronica and Jasmine but quickly growing to a group of 20, then 50, then over 100 women moving in unison through forms that had been passed down through generations of Chinese grandmothers who'd understood that survival sometimes meant being soft enough to bend without breaking. Veronica's transformation was the most dramatic. She still maintained her protection business, but something had changed in how she operated. Instead of ruling through fear alone, she began offering something else, training in Maya's Tai Chi in exchange for commissary items, creating an economy based on self-improvement rather than pure exploitation. She'd stand beside Maya during the morning sessions, translating the complex movements into language the street-hardened women could understand. This ain't about being weak. It's about being so in control of yourself that nobody can control you. The photograph of Maya's grandmother became something of a shrine in their cell block. Maya had it laminated in the prison workshop and hung it on the wall where everyone could see it during practice. Women who'd never shown vulnerability began sharing stories of their own grandmothers, their own lost wisdom, their own connections to something deeper than the circumstances that had brought them here. The movement grew beyond just Tai Chi. It became about reclaiming a sense of dignity that the prison system had tried to strip away. 3 months into what inmates started calling the awakening, the warden took notice. Dr. Patricia Huang, a reform-minded administrator who'd been fighting for rehabilitation programs against budget constraints and political resistance, saw an opportunity. She called Maya to her office, a meeting that would have terrified anyone 6 months ago, but which Maya approached with the same calm she brought to everything now. "I've been watching what you've created," Dr. Huang said, gesturing to surveillance footage of the morning practice sessions. "This is more effective than any program we've tried to implement. Would you be willing to make it official?" Maya's response surprised the warden. "Only if Veronica co-teaches. She's the one who made it possible for others to listen. Without her, I'm just the quiet girl nobody notices. With her, we're proof that anyone can change." It was a masterstroke of understanding. Maya recognized that Veronica's conversion carried more weight than her own teachings ever could. A feared criminal choosing growth over violence was more powerful than any motivational speech or mandatory program. The first official class of the Riverside Tai Chi program drew coverage from local news, then national attention when a video of 100 women moving in perfect synchronization went viral. But the moment that truly showed how far things had come happened during a prison inspection, when a fight broke out between 2 new arrivals in the yard. Before the guards could intervene, Veronica and 5 of her crew stepped in, not with violence but with the redirection techniques Maya had taught them, separating the fighters without throwing a single punch, de-escalating through movement rather than force. Maya received news that week that her case was being reviewed, that new evidence had emerged about her employer's fraud scheme that might lead to her exoneration. The lawyer said she could be out within months if things went well. That night, she found Veronica in their usual practice spot, standing alone in the moonlight working through the form they'd practiced that morning. "You're going to leave," Veronica said without turning around. It wasn't a question. Maya moved beside her, matching her movements like a shadow finding its source. "My grandmother used to say that teachers appear when students are ready, and disappear when they're ready to become teachers themselves." "I wasn't ready." Veronica's voice cracked slightly. "When you got here, I was so busy being strong in all the wrong ways that I couldn't see what real strength looked like." She stopped moving and turned to face Maya. "That thing with your grandmother's photo, I'm sorry. I dishonored something sacred because I was scared of what you represented." Maya reached out and took Veronica's hands, rough from years of fighting, and positioned them in the opening stance of the first form. "You're ready now. That's all that matters." The morning Maya Chen was released from Riverside Women's Correctional Facility, the entire population lined the fence of the exercise yard, not in protest or anger but in synchronized movement, 300 women performing the Tai Chi form she taught them, their bodies moving like wheat in wind under the bright California sun. Veronica stood at the front, leading them through Parting the Clouds with a grace that would have been unimaginable 8 months earlier, when she'd ruled through fear rather than respect. Maya watched from the transport van, her few belongings in a paper bag beside her, the photograph of her grandmother pressed against her heart, and wept for the first time since her arrest. Not from sadness but from witnessing transformation she'd never thought possible. The farm in Nebraska was gone, sold to pay legal fees, but Maya's story had traveled further than she knew. The viral video of the prison Tai Chi program had caught the attention of Chun Wei, a distant cousin of her grandmother who ran a martial arts academy in San Francisco and had been searching for family members since arriving in America 20 years ago. He offered Maya not just a job but a mission: to teach Tai Chi to at-risk youth, to share her grandmother's wisdom with another generation that needed to learn that true strength came from within. The circle was completing itself in ways that Lily Chun could never have imagined when she taught her granddaughter those movements in the wheat fields. 6 months later, Maya received a letter from Veronica, written in careful handwriting on prison stationery. "We're up to 200 regular practitioners now. Got 3 other prisons requesting to start programs. The warden says I might get early release consideration for exceptional rehabilitation and positive influence on prison population. Funny how things work out. I spent 7 years being the hardest woman in here, and it took you 8 months to show me that being soft was actually harder." Enclosed was a photo from the yard, women of every race, age, and background moving in perfect unison, with Veronica in front, teaching. The letter continued, "Jasmine got her GED and is teaching the forms to the new arrivals. She says to tell you she finally understands what your grandmother meant about power announcing itself. Real power whispers, she says, and everyone leans in to hear it. Carlotta took the longest to come around, but she's teaching the evening sessions now. Says it helps her sleep without nightmares for the first time in 12 years. We voted to call it the Lily Chen Movement Program, after your grandmother. Hope that's okay." Maya's academy in San Francisco's Chinatown became a sanctuary for kids who reminded her of herself and Veronica. Caught between worlds, struggling with identity, carrying anger they didn't know how to release. She taught them the same forms her grandmother had taught her, but more importantly, she taught them the story of Riverside, of how the most feared woman in a California prison had learned to lead through grace rather than violence, how transformation was possible even in the most unlikely places. Parents brought their troubled teenagers, saying they'd heard about the woman who'd changed a prison without throwing a single punch. 3 years after her release, Maya was invited back to Riverside for the dedication of the Lily Chun Memorial Garden, a meditation space in the yard where inmates could practice Tai Chi surrounded by plants they'd grown themselves. Veronica was there, released 2 months earlier, wearing civilian clothes that looked foreign on her frame but standing with the same presence she'd developed through those morning practices. They performed the complete form together, teacher and student who'd become equals, while current inmates watched and learned that change was possible, that strength had many faces, that sometimes the quietest person in the room carried the most power. Dr. Huang, the warden, gave a speech about rehabilitation and second chances, but it was Veronica who spoke the words that mattered. Maya Chen came here as a victim of circumstances, falsely accused and far from home. She had every reason to become bitter, to let this place break her like it broke so many of us. Instead, she taught us that our grandmother's wisdom didn't die with them, that culture and tradition could survive even in concrete and razor wire, that being strong enough to be gentle was the greatest power of all. She paused, looking at the assembled crowd. She taught me that my fists were prisons I'd built for myself, and that opening them was the first step to freedom. The program spread to 50 prisons across California within 5 years, then went national, each one teaching the forms that Lily Chun had brought from China and passed to her granddaughter in a Nebraska wheat field. Academic studies were written about the dramatic reduction in violence, the improvement in prisoner mental health, the transformation of prison culture from the inside out. But Maya knew the real victory wasn't in statistics or papers. It was in the letters she received, hundreds of them, from women who'd learned to stand in their power without standing on others, who discovered that their grandmother's strength lived in them still, waiting to be acknowledged. Maya never returned to farming, but she kept a small wheat field behind her academy, where she taught advanced students the same way her grandmother had taught her, through movement disguised as work, through wisdom hidden in simplicity. Sometimes, in the early morning when the sun caught the grain just right, she could feel Lily Chen's presence, approval radiating like warmth on her face. The photograph, now framed in her office, showed her grandmother standing in that same field, but Maya knew the real memorial wasn't in images or memory. It was in every person who learned to redirect force rather than meet it, who chose grace over violence, who understood that true power never needed to announce itself because its effects rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The last time Maya visited Riverside, for the 10th anniversary of the program, she found something extraordinary. In the mess hall where Veronica had once confronted her over spilled food, where power had shifted through movement rather than violence, there was now a mural painted by the inmates. It showed a wheat field bending in the wind, not breaking but flowing, and in the foreground, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was the figure of an elderly Chinese woman, arms raised in the first position of Tai Chi, teaching anyone willing to learn that survival meant more than endurance. It meant transformation. If the story moved you, if it reminded you that strength comes in forms we don't always recognize, that wisdom can survive even in the hardest places, then share it with someone who needs to remember their own power. Subscribe to Acts of Depth for more stories that reveal the extraordinary strength hidden in ordinary people, and remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who can change everything, not through force but through the patient teaching of a better way. Your grandmother's wisdom, whatever form it took, lives in you still, waiting for the moment when you're brave enough to share it with a world that desperately needs to remember that true power flows like water, finding its way around every obstacle, wearing down the hardest stones not through violence but through persistence, through grace, through the courage to be gentle in a world that mistakes gentleness for weakness.